all of you who are coming into our webinar today. We're going to pause just for another few seconds while the Zoom technology brings us all together. I'm Dan Esty from Yale University and will play the role of moderator here today. And very much looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have, and full to all of you who've taken time out of your busy days and busy lives to be part of this discussion. Again, it takes just a minute for Zoom to bring us all together. So we'll begin in just a few seconds here, but want to make sure everybody is brought into the system and all who are interested can hear the discussion back and forth. We are going to be hearing from a number of speakers today, so you should see them as they are called upon to speak. We also will, in about 45 minutes, be moving from speaker presentations to questions and answers. And so any of you who would like to ask a question are invited to do so using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So let's begin now. Again, I'm Dan Esty. I'm a professor at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, as well as the Yale Law School. And it's really a pleasure for me to be the moderator of our discussion today, bringing together an effort at Yale to really think about sustainability and to push discussions of that topic through something we call the Yale Environmental Dialogue, together with UNITAR. And we're very excited to be able to partner with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and particularly the New York office of UNITAR on the program today. And I should really start by saying a very warm World Environment Day welcome to all of you. This is a chance for us to celebrate the progress on the environment, to think together about the important issues that remain to be addressed, but there is much to celebrate as well as much that remains to be done. And we will focus today on pathways to a sustainable future. Starting off with that conversation, building on a book that's just come out, put out from Yale, that is called A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And the conversation will launch today with 4 of the authors that contributed essays to that volume. So again, 40 big ideas, 4 of them you'll have introduced to you today. And it is a challenging moment in many regards for the conversation we're having. Some of the issues of sustainability have been looming large for years now. One of our speakers, Tom Lovejoy, has been calling out the challenges of biodiversity for decades. Sue Biennial will be commenting as well, and she's been working on climate change, perhaps the biggest existential threat for decades as well. But we are, as we think about sustainability, also operating in the shadow of a terrible pandemic, a global public health threat that has challenged people all over the world, and then economic consequences that flow from that. And obviously in the United States, we're facing additional issues, issues of racial justice and structural inequality that have really wrenched our society and brought to the fore some critical issues that America needs to deal with. So all of that does frame the conversation today. And in many regards, these issues are interlinked. Some of the very challenges around who's susceptible to the COVID-19 virus relate to questions of environmental public health and weaknesses and inequalities in the public health system in many countries. So I do think this gives us a framing that is important. With that, I would like to introduce my colleague in organizing this, Ambassador Marcos Suazo, who is originally from Honduras, has been in the United Nations in New York for many decades, representing originally Honduras, and then more recently serving in the UN system structure. He is currently the head of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research Office at the UN headquarters in New York, and it's really been a great pleasure to work with Ambassador Suazo on this project. So Ambassador, the virtual microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for such a kind introduction. Has been a blessing and an inspiration to work with you directly and with the Yale University School of Forestry for this important event. Usually we have very challenging times in our minds and in your heads, and the most pressing need for us is to secure a better planet and a better future for the younger generations. I have a son who is 20 years old, and is my only concern that he get a better environment and a better planet for him and his family. So we are honored and pleased to be with you. Thank you for the many decades in the UN. It looks a lot. It means a lot to me because I am a believer in the United Nations systems, in the multilateralism, and above all, I believe in the great cause of the United Nations. World Environmental Day was born in June 5th, appropriately today. It was the first official day of the conference that was celebrated in 1972. And we commemorate that particular day. The main topic on discussion on those days was the transboundary pollution, such as acid rain. It was discussed at the conference as an important, the conference itself was an important step along the way to establishing principles of a better environmental governance of our planet, building on limits of growth, publication of the same year of the MIT researchers committed by the Club of Rome. So there is a lot of history on the Environmental Day. There is a lot of work that has been done, but there is much more that we can do. And I really wanted to congratulate Yale for stepping up on this time and putting this on the agenda. And a green day today is raining and gray in New York. There is a ray of hope when we have this discussion to protect our environment, to protect our planet for the younger generations to come. I totally agree with you on the COVID pandemic and the stress situation, the racial issues that we are facing today. Those issues are not confined in a border situation. They are universal. They touch every single human being. And that's why we are very proud to join effort with Yale to try to break those boundaries and those barriers in order to diffuse a more human message to everybody, to the humanity by itself. Yale has doing a great work on that areas. I am so pleased to see all the deans of Yale University, like Ingrid Burk, Mary Ashton, Maria Chertow, our colleagues Tom Lovejoy and Subinit from the United Nations Foundations, Dan Hasty. All of you, I am really happy to welcome officially to this event, and assuring you that UNITAR will always be at reach, and we always be able to help and to collaborate with Yale in the future. So thank you once again, and it's an honor to be part of this meeting today.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for those words of welcome. It's really a pleasure to be within the UN system for this conversation. And we do extend a special welcome to all those from the different missions and the different offices in the United Nations, both in New York and around the world, to this conversation. And we salute the efforts you do to bring important issues to the UN groups all over the United Nations system, not just in New York, but around the world. We share your sense that the issues we're going to discuss today are of universal concern. And I think we do share your sense of the deep interdependence of all of us on this planet and needing to work together to respond. So it's now my honor to introduce Dean Indy Burk, Dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She's been a professor in the ecological science arena for many decades, thinking about some of these issues that we have on the table today. She came to Yale 4 years ago as the first female dean of a school that had been in existence for already nearly 120 years. So we salute her for breaking new ground in that regard. She previously was the dean of the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming. So she's got a perspective from across the United States and increasingly now across the world as well. Dean Burk.
Thanks so much, Dan. I want to thank you, Ambassador Suazo, and it is such a pleasure to work with the UN on World Environment Day. I'm just thrilled that Yale can partner on this effort to celebrate together, even though we're distant. There's really no more important organization that we could partner with. Let me start by saying a few things about the Yale partner in this, the Yale Environmental Dialogue. A few years ago, our school, now called the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, but very soon to be known as the Yale School of the Environment, created the Yale Environmental Dialogue as a way to bring new ideas and new energy to the conversation about environmental sustainability. Like so many others, we've been frustrated watching as political divisions and disagreements over core principles have kept us from reaching real progress in tackling so many of the really urgent environmental challenges. To help remedy this, the Yale Environmental Dialogue has convened some of the world's most respected environmental leaders from a range of disciplines, sectors, and political perspectives to engage in some pretty difficult but essential conversations. We know that if we're going to address these challenges in a meaningful way, we have to do the hard work of bridging divides. And I'd like to echo the ambassador and Dan to say that while we focus today on the environment, which is a long-term critical challenge, we do so against a backdrop of other tremendous challenges that have been recently magnified and magnifying related divides. And these are the challenges of social injustice and racism, and a new and more recent challenge of the pandemic, which is also rife with issues of inequality disproportionately impacting people of color. These are tragedies playing out before our eyes and those that highlight divides, and they underscore the need for real leadership and the need for dialogue across those divides, the need for more collaboration and coming together to find a common purpose and forward motion for sustaining lives, for sustaining society, and sustaining the environment, all of which are deeply intertwined. Our project, the Yale Environmental Dialogue, addresses those complex interactions and supports the idea that new ideas are needed and dialogue is crucial. And over the past year, we've hosted discussions across the US. But we know that while we face so many of these challenges and obstacles in the US, environmental challenges today are not local, regional, or even national. In fact, most critical problems we face are global in nature, and they require cooperation and participation across national and global lines. That's why on World Environmental Day, we're so excited to co-host this event with UNITAR. Together, we feature 4 experts who did share their own expertise and innovation in the book we published last fall, A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. They epitomize the spirit of innovation and cross-disciplinary collaboration that we're trying to promote, both through our Yale Environmental Dialogue and through our partnership with UNITAR today. So now, Dan Esty, back to you, Hillhouse Professor of Environmental Law and Policy in our school and the Yale Law School, and the leader of the Yale Environmental Dialogue, to introduce the panelists. Thank you all again for joining us today.
Dean Burk, thank you very much. It's wonderful to have an opportunity to carry this conversation that we've been part of at Yale into the UN system, as I've mentioned. And we do have 4 speakers who are going to help us do that. The first is Mark Ashton. He's the Jessup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology at Yale. He also serves as director of the School Forests. So our School of Forestry and Environmental Studies does in fact have forests that we manage as part of our learning experience for the students who are focused on forest issues. He does research on the biological and physical processes that govern the regeneration of natural forests and the creation of agroforestry analogs. So he's got a very broad base to bring wisdom to the issue of what is the forest dimension of a sustainable future. So Mark, please take it away. And for those of you who are listening in, we'll have 4 speakers open the conversation with some thoughts and comments from their own piece of the sustainability story. And then we'll turn to your questions and answers. So for those who are interested, the Q&A box, Q&A function on your Zoom screen is where you can lodge a question, and we will be pulling those questions up in a few minutes after our opening speakers. So Mark Ashton, please take the virtual microphone.
So thank you, Dan. So Dan makes a good point here is what the hell is the silviculturalist doing speaking about forests? And I'm a biologist in my heart, a naturalist in my heart. But what I'm going to be talking about primarily, though I am someone who understands and tries to understand how forests grow, are some of the social and economic issues around forests and the dilemma that we face around how we value forests for future generations. So it's really a social question, and I am a biologist, so please forgive me. That's the first sort of statement I'd like to make. I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, I'm also a practicing forester, and I also widely work with colleagues throughout South and Southeast Asia and in the neotropics in Latin America around these issues of forests. And though I work on the technical issues around forests, I am very much engaged in observing some of the big social issues in terms of valuing the monetary value of forests and some of the big social inequities around forests. Forests really are both undervalued, and there's an enormous amount of environmental injustice around forests that we often do not understand, and they're extremely complex. I am today going to make a lot of generalizations, and if you know about forests, it is all about the socioeconomic, cultural, and biological context of place. So my generalizations are general, but they do vary enormously from place to place. And the first thing we need to think about when we talk about forests and we talk about trees is that they come in all shapes and sizes, from cities and open spaces and green spaces, all the way through agricultural systems, to second growth forests, to riparian and coastal forests, to wildlands. So in and of themselves, they are extremely biologically diverse. And that makes it difficult. It makes it difficult for us as policymakers, as regulators, as managers, to try and create laws, techniques, tools that work with every social and cultural context. In my opinion, forests have to be managed from the bottom up. They have to be managed place-based. They have to be managed in context because of not only the biological complexity of just what I mentioned, but also because of the social and economic complexity. Every place is different, but there are some generalities. Trees, forests are permanent. They live for a long time. They require investment. They require social stability. And when we think about economics and we think about society, we're generally not socially stable. In many parts of the world, we're very socially unstable with a lot of inequities. And we have very poor capacities of managing and predicting and valuing in the economic perspective for the long term, for a tree's life, rather than for the short term. And therein lies some of the complexities of why trees and forests have these innate problems in trying to fit and fulfill sustainability goals. They don't fit the economic and social construct of how we value economy today. Many of them have very difficult, soft market values that when we cut a forest down, we then therefore understand that value in a much clearer way. Values around biodiversity. 2/3 of the forests comprise the biodiversity of the land. Okay, 2/3. Excuse me, I have a cat in the background. I apologize. She's 20 years old. Anyway, a part of my biodiversity. And then we have water. Where does water come from? It comes from forests, clean drinking water, irrigation, agriculture. They come from forests. Open space recreation. And all the shelter and many of the food products that we now often have domesticated or that we exploit from our native forests come from native forest habitats. Coffee, cacao, tea, all the medicinals, herbs that we think about, all the wood products, the paper products, the energy. 1/3 of the populace today still relies upon fuel wood, charcoal from living biomass. They're very difficult. They are multitudes, they are complex, and they're very difficult to value in the long term. And so that is the crux of the problem. We as a society have historically, I don't know a single country that has not exploited its natural resources, namely its forests first, to generate and monetize its economy, transform its economy, and then think about what has happened to that forest afterwards. The developed nations did this during the Industrial Revolution. The developing nations are doing this now. It's a social transformation that we pay for because of the short-sightedness that we have in how we try and work with land and social transformations, but at the same time work to sustain the value of those forests. And we do not do that effectively. And the reason why we don't do that effectively is because those forests and those multiple values, those difficult multiple values, are not generally valued. 6 billion hectares of forest now to 4 billion, and only 1/3 of that 4 billion, would be considered largely intact. The majority is of second growth, particularly in developing nations, recuperating post-industrial revolution, going through the next wave of transformation that relates to fragmentation, development, invasives, insects, diseases, on top of climate change. And of course, in the developing world, the land transformation is going on now. Clearance, both by colonization, something that happened in the developed nations during the Industrial Revolution and for smallholders, but also for industrial commercialization. Land clearances that should probably never take place. Most forests are on marginal landscapes, uplands, relatively infertile soils. Agriculture, industrial agriculture that cannot be maintained in the way and in the inputs, the reliance upon inorganic fertilizers that cannot be maintained for the future in the long term. So what to do? I'm a technologist. I work on trying to devise technical ways of improving and restoring and protecting and managing sustainability from a biophysical and biological construct. But you can't do anything in investment in terms of a biological construct before you invest in a social economic construct. Social and economic stability means viability for something that you invest in today to gain in the future. And that's what managing forests is all about. That's what restoring forests is all about. 90% of our forests, this is an anomaly where in North America, well, the US is an anomaly. 90% of all our forests is publicly owned by governments nations, states, municipalities, but they are conflicted because they are in name only. That tenure system is unstable. It's claimed by governments, but over communities, over indigenous communities, over communities, smallholders, people who live on that landscape, who have the rightful claim to those public lands. So there's a question of trying to recognize and stabilize land tenure. It's hugely important for forests. You have to stabilize land tenure to invest in the future. The other is environmental regulation. There are many countries that have environmental regulation on the books, but they are not enforced, and they are appropriate. But there are many countries that have environmental regulations that are contrary to trying to protect forests. They promote conversion of forests. So those phenomena need to be corrected. Enforcement of appropriate regulations and creation of regulations that incentivizes protection of forests for use. And then the other is markets, diversity of markets. The reason why forests are often cleared is because they're perceived of not having any markets, any diverse, strong markets that allow them to be protected by communities, by society. Markets for water, markets for climate, markets for biodiversity conservation, markets for recreation, stronger markets for timber, believe it or not, stronger markets for various food products that are cultivated in forests. Those create incentives for protection by local communities, not by governments, but by people who want to protect them. Those are developing that social construct around particularly lands that are considered public, but with very weak land tenure and governance is essential. And I'm going to stop there before I get into any kind of biological recommendations. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much for setting up the forest dimension of the challenge in front of us with all of its complexity and depth. We're going to now go in a very different direction. Marion Chertow. Marion is also a professor at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She's a professor of industrial environmental management. She's got a secondary appointment, by the way, at the National University of Singapore. Her research and teaching focuses on industrial ecology, the business environment interface, including in the industrial ecology area, the circular economy, closed loops, industrial symbiosis. But her longest standing focus has been waste management, and she does a lot of work as well on urban sustainability. I also did one of my very first books with her, so it's a special joy to introduce Marion Chertow.
I'm delighted to see you, Dan, and thanks very much to the organizers. I'm delighted to see you, Dan, and thank you to all the organizers for today. I wanted to show this particular slide today, and I think a lot of our speakers have already indicated that so much is going on in the world today and in the US. Many people forget that Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, because the sanitation workers there, the garbage persons, the garbage men, as you see, he says, "I am a man," were on strike and they needed some help. And although Dr. King offered help, it is also the place where he was assassinated. This was a fight for economic justice. What did these men want? They wanted safer conditions, better pay. Black Lives Matter was a message that could have been said then, given the makeup of the Memphis Sanitation Department. So I show this because my small part of today is to talk about waste itself. And clearly, if we didn't have this much waste, we wouldn't have this much problem. And also remember that the reason we pick up waste is because of sanitation, is because of public health. It's just the thing that we are reminded about in something like the COVID case. So I'd like to talk about my chapter that I wrote with my PhD student, Matt Gordon. It's called Waste and Materials Management, from Harm Reduction to Value Creation. So let me jump right in and say that on World Environment Day, wouldn't it be great if we could care for nature, not by adding society's waste to rotting and oozing landfills? Let's not do that. Let's manage our lives and our wastes better and go beyond that to creating value. That's what we say in the chapter. It doesn't need to be waste so often. We can use these materials again. Now, I'm not talking about industrial waste or mining waste, but the everyday waste of people and businesses, what we call municipal solid waste. You know, once you make waste, your options are really very limited. You can throw it away on the land. We do that in the US. More than half of our waste is landfill. You can throw it in the water. That's water pollution. You can throw it into the air when you burn waste and the smoke goes into the air. What's left? That's it. Those are the only options. So the alternative, which is taught all around the world, is the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. And I won't go into that. I think everyone knows about reduce, reuse, recycle. But imagine even drumming that into people's heads for decades now. At least the US is still spending most of that waste and sending it right into the landfill. But across the globe, not only is waste managed differently, but the waste itself is of different composition. And so there really isn't one solution. There's just no magic bullet here. In most developing countries, over half the waste is organic. So think about food waste and garden waste and paper and so forth. That can have a life after it's discarded that's quite different from, for example, the US, where most of our waste is not in those categories. But we look at all types of metals and look at all types of plastics and so forth as such a big composition for us. So in this case, we have to pursue different technologies. I remember recently visiting a plant in Accra in Ghana, where they were taking mixed waste, all the waste mixed together, and their primary product was composting, because the compost is what comes from an organic waste stream, and the rest was the stuff that was left over. So around the world, on average, and this is pretty shocking, it used to be much less, but today the average global amount of waste produced per person per day is 450 grams, about 1 pound for you Americans in there. And that's pretty amazing. Now there's a huge variation. The US is number one in waste generation per capita. And of course, poorer nations generate much less waste. We could learn a lot from them. And so we have a great amount to contend with. 6.5 billion people, 6.5 billion pounds, it adds up so much every day. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more about recycling and say, how can we create less waste and more value? And one answer is we have to be willing to change. Even our existing systems aren't keeping up, and some of the problems are kind of strange. So I was reading some articles over the weekend that were in fast company by a very well-known professor in the US, Don Norman at the University of San Diego. He's an expert on human design systems. So imagine all his life, he's tried to figure out how we could improve the human interface. And the name of his article is, "Even I Can't Figure Out Recycling," because it's so confusing now. It's so difficult to say, well, where should I put what? And what do I do with this greasy pizza box? And he actually calls the US system a design failing of colossal magnitude, where we don't even know where to put our waste. So I think we've all experienced that at the airport, in your kitchen. And we see this as an interesting problem because it seems so solvable, and yet it's so difficult to figure out the best system and to communicate that well. So we have big problems, we have little problems. I'd like to conclude by talking about two rules of thumb that came out of writing our chapter. And the first, of course, is preserve rather than throw away. We want to preserve the materials and energy that are going into our products as much as we can. And again, here's where the US has a lot to learn about preserving and reusing. We're doing a lot more of it, which is great. Lots of young people want to get involved with waste streams and make shoes out of old water bottles and all the things that really can be done. The second rule of thumb is that we have to set our priorities on the whole material system. We can't just look at what happens at the end, but we have to say, why are we making our goods in such a way that we can't remanufacture them, reuse them? So we need to use life cycle thinking to accomplish the goals of waste and materials management that we want to accomplish. Thank you very much.
Marian, thank you very much. Thank you for giving us insight into another of the challenges in front of us from a sustainability perspective. And I do want to say before turning to our next panelist, Tom Lovejoy, that the Q&A function on the Zoom system is now up and running. Our team is capturing questions that you'd like me to ask to the panelists after Tom and Subiniaz provide their opening presentations. So please do jump in and give us the questions that you're eager to hear answers from specific panelists for. Our next speaker is Professor Tom Lovejoy. He's currently the University Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. He leads the George Mason Institute for Sustainable Earth. And Tom Lovejoy is perhaps most famous for his longtime work in the Amazon, which has been running since 1980, a 40-year track on forest fragmentation, but also his understanding of and focus on issues of biological diversity. And he has, in fact, been given credit for coining that term and creating that research agenda. He is, for purposes of today, and perhaps most importantly, a fellow at the UN Foundation. And it's really a great pleasure to have Tom with us to talk about his view of the sustainability challenge and the pathways we need to follow. I turn over to you, the conversation.
So thank you, Dan, and thank you to UNITAR and the Yale Environmental Dialogue for the opportunity to be part of this fascinating discussion of our challenges and the ways forward. So I'm going to talk mostly about biodiversity and climate change with an important way of getting out of essentially the great sort of challenge we're creating for ourselves. But let me just start by saying at the outset that biodiversity is actually the hardest of all the environmental problems to tackle. And it's because all the other environmental problems, in fact, are environmental problems because they affect biological systems. So biodiversity is integrating all of those as well as all the ways in which we disrupt and destroy biological diversity directly. So I want to spend most of my time thinking about climate change. And I've studied the interaction between climate change and biodiversity for about 30 years now. When I first looked at it, all one could really do was look at how biodiversity had responded to past climate change in the geologic past, try and project that. By the time the second book came out, you could see the fingerprints anywhere you looked on the planet of climate change on biodiversity. And the most recent, which came out in 2019, basically we've gotten to the point where we are very close to major disruption of the biological systems of the planet. So you've all heard people talk about stopping at 2 degrees. And the reality is most of that discussion about where it would be prudent to stop and in terms of the increasing climate change is actually seen through the lens of physical scientists. Biological scientists did not have a lot to do with talking about the 2-degree target. If anything, it was chosen because people thought it might actually be doable. But as we have seen more and more of the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, it becomes quite obvious that 2 degrees is actually too much. We've already seen tropical coral reefs coming apart because the fundamental partnership between the coral animal and the alga falls apart and the whole ecosystem collapses in bleaching events. We've seen it in tipping the balance in the coniferous forests of Western North America in favor of pine bark beetles. So there are areas where 70% of those trees have been killed by the beetles. And interestingly, most recently, the tropical forests, which I've spent a lot of my own scientific career paying attention to, a paper came out within the last 10 days, which sends a bit of a chill through me to say it, that it will be really hard to maintain tropical forests on this planet if we go beyond 1.5 degrees. So, and on top of all of that, to nod to our current pandemic situation, all the natural systems of the planet have pathogens naturally circulating in them. And when you start putting ripples of change through all those ecosystems because of climate change, it's inevitable that the frequency of potential pandemics will increase. So that's a big argument about the imperative of doing something about all of this. And the good news is there are things that can be done, things that have been right in front of us for a long time and we haven't particularly paid attention to. Yes, there is a major agenda about reforming our energy base and getting off the fossil fuels, which essentially are nothing but ancient photosynthesis produced by ancient ecosystems that we are releasing in an instant, in a geological instant by burning them. So the sooner we are off fossil fuels, the better. But we're actually at the moment headed for way beyond 1.5 degrees. The 1.5 degree planet would be one in which the carbon in the atmosphere would stabilize at around 350 parts per million. And we are already way beyond that. We're at 415. So it looks, if you just look at it simplistically like that, very grim indeed. But it is not. The good news is that the natural world and biological diversity has a huge amount to contribute to our arriving at a soft landing for humanity and the rest of life on Earth. So at the moment, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere from destroyed terrestrial nature is essentially equivalent to what remains in extant terrestrial nature. I'm so far the only person who sort of states it that way. Most people talk about it in the numbers, but I think actually it will help you understand a bit better how nature can help us out of our predicament if I portray it that way. So it turns out that the amount of CO2 that's up there from destroyed nature is much larger than anybody realized before a couple of years ago. And it's about 450 to 500 billion tons of carbon. And if we wanted to pull out 1 part per million, we basically have to find a way to get biological systems to grow and take essentially 2.2 billion tons of carbon out for every part per million. So to go from where we are right now at 415 parts per million to the 350 part per million soft landing, we would need to pull out essentially 65 parts per million, which is roughly 147 billion tons, if I've done it correctly. And that we can do by restoring ecosystems at a planetary scale, by recognizing our planet works as a linked biological and physical system. And the extra good news is there's plenty of reason to do that for its own merits, for all the ecosystems services that we gain from restored forests, from restored coastal wetlands, from agricultural systems that don't leak carbon and accumulate it and get more fertile soil. So around the planet, if we wake up to this, we could engage people individually. So this is no longer a huge monster problem that nobody can do anything about except governments, because everybody can help plant a tree or shovel some mud for restoring a wetland. So the solution that I'm trying to outline here is actually recognizing that the planet works as a linked biological and physical system, that all that biological diversity in restored ecosystems confers untold and uncalculated, but very significant benefits to human society. And all we need to do is really recognize the importance of nature. So thank you very much.
Tom, thank you very much. Really appreciate the depth and breadth of your perspective, the sustainability challenge broadly, on the biodiversity dimension, the critical link to climate change. And that really does provide us a nice segue. Our final presenter, Sue Biennial. Sue served for over 30 years in the US government, in the State Department, in the legal advisor's office, where she was deputy legal advisor and on the legal dimensions of many of the environmental efforts that the United States participated in global community over the past 3 decades. She also has had a major role in the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. And so it's really a pleasure to have her here today. Tom, Sue is a senior fellow at the UN Foundation. She's also a senior advisor at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions and a distinguished senior fellow at Climate Advisors. Sue, please take the virtual microphone.
Thank you so much, Dan. So my chapter is, as you predict, about the Paris Agreement, and my thesis is that the Paris Agreement can't do it alone. So what is Paris? In a nutshell, it's a global agreement on climate change from 2015. It was viewed as very significant, partly politically, because it took so many years and it was so difficult to reach agreement on it, and partly substantively, because it ended up being more ambitious than really anybody expected. It's a long-term agreement. As Tom says, it sets a global temperature, kind of a limit on the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, or better yet, 1.5 degrees. And it sets up various mechanisms to help achieve that goal. Parties have to put in their own emissions commitments. They're called nationally determined contributions. Every 5 years, the parties do a collective review. How well are they doing in terms of the temperature goal? The parties update their nationally determined contributions in light of the global review every 5 years. And there's an extensive transparency system where countries are reviewed individually for their emissions and how well they're doing in terms of implementing their nationally determined contributions. So why do I say that the agreement can't do it alone? Well, it's an unusual agreement by the standards of an international environmental agreement. So most international environmental agreements, I would say, are relatively self-contained. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but bear with me. Countries agree on commitments. They're written down, they're negotiated, they're spelled out in the agreement. Countries go home and implement those commitments, and maybe there's some funding or capacity building outside of the agreement from some kind of World Bank related fund. But in general, a normal agreement kind of takes care of itself and doesn't implicate, the entire UN system. But Paris isn't like that. It needs a lot of help from other institutions and other agreements. Why? Well, I'm going to list 7 or 8 reasons very quickly. The first is that the goal of the Paris Agreement, or one of the main goals, is a really tall order. It's very ambitious. To reach this temperature goal of limiting global increase to well below 2 degrees or 1.5 requires the transformation of the global economy. And in that sense, it goes way beyond really just an environmental agreement. Implicates energy systems, implicates agriculture. And as Tom says, it's probably not good enough to reach well below 2 degrees. The IPCC has basically said as much. Even if you limit temperature increase to 1.5, you're still going to have significant negative impacts in the world. The second is the basic design of the agreement. It's based on nationally determined contributions, not negotiated commitments. So parties, in order to come up with ambitious commitments, are going to have to feel comfortable doing that. And they're going to have to be prodded from the outside world to come up with ambitious commitments. The Secretary General of the UN himself held a climate summit last September, basically with that goal in mind of getting countries to kind of step up their nationally determined contributions. And that's one of many international efforts. The third is that many developing countries are going to need financial assistance and capacity building on a much bigger scale than you would normally find in an international environmental agreement. And beyond just that kind of assistance, really the financial flows in the world are going to have to be greened. People talk about it as aligning financial flows in the world, like the trillions, not just the billions, with the Paris Agreement's objectives. The fourth is that there could be external impediments to implementation of the Paris Agreement. Dan and I have worked on an online book on this subject. If the Paris Agreement works as it's supposed to work, works properly, and if the parties' nationally determined contributions, in fact, get more and more ambitious over time, as they're supposed to do, it's likely that at least some of them are going to be challenged from a trade point of view, like, for example, in the WTO or under investment agreements. And there's a lot of uncertainty there as to what the rules are. And the WTO has not really kind of grappled with that issue to date. The fifth is that for certain issues, other venues might be or will be more appropriate than the Paris Agreement for discussing them. So, for example, the Paris Agreement says, the parties should facilitate technology development, technology transfer. But if countries are actually going to eliminate tariffs on climate-friendly goods, they're unlikely to do that under the Paris Agreement. They just don't have the expertise there. It's likely to be done in a smaller venue, such as the negotiations of an environmental goods agreement, which was begun but stalled in 2016. The sixth is that in the case of some issues, and I will include international aviation and international maritime issues, other regimes have been specifically designated by the climate regime to be handled elsewhere. In part because the climate parties had a very difficult time and could not actually agree on how do you attribute emissions from activities that take place outside the jurisdiction of any country. So those are being handled somewhere else. The seventh is that certain issues are just so inherently cross-cutting that they cry out for treatment in other fora. One is oceans. The ocean is a victim of climate change in terms of both warming and acidification. It's also a potential solution or partial solution to climate change. And while on the one hand, the Paris Agreement needs to take better account of ocean issues, which is something the parties are working on, ocean fora need to take better account of climate aspects. Similarly, forests, and Tom mentions the link between climate and biodiversity. The forests serve as a sink of carbon, but they're also a home to biodiversity. So you can't really address the climate issue without also addressing the biodiversity issue in relevant fora outside of the Paris Agreement. Finally, in addition to the temperature increase goal in the Paris Agreement, another one of its objectives is to enhance resilience and adaptation to adverse climate impacts. And that aspect of Paris implicates so many other fields that they absolutely must be taken up outside the Paris context. They will implicate displacement, migration of people, international security issues, law of the sea implications as sea level rises, et cetera, et cetera. So those are my 7 or 8 reasons why Paris needs help in the outside world. So how is the world doing? Well, so far it's been quite a mixed response. As you could probably expect, most of the help to the Paris goals has come from environmental agreements and fora. For example, the Montreal Protocol has adopted an amendment on hydrofluorocarbons, which are a major greenhouse gas. The Civil Aviation Organization and the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, have taken some steps, ICAO more than IMO, in the direction of limiting carbon dioxide emissions. The international financial institutions have to a certain extent moved in the direction of greening finance and aligning their lending practices with nationally determined contributions of the recipient countries, but much more needs to be done. In terms of the World Trade Organization, not much has happened really at all on the climate front, and the Environmental Goods Agreement, which is being negotiated by a subset of parties, is basically stalled. Arguably, non-state actors, interestingly, have picked up some of the slack, and one could even make the argument that they are helping out the Paris Agreement more than the official international agreements and institutions. So what do I think should be done? Ideally, each regime, I think, that is relevant in the world would be trying to figure out how it could make its contribution to the addressing the climate challenge, either in terms of what it could do more positively or what it's doing that's negative that should be reversed. Short of that, which because it isn't completely happening, I had in my chapter called for a SWAT team, which is probably a bad metaphor these days. So I'll just call it a team to do it for them. So to basically go through, figure out what does the Paris Agreement need in terms of help from that institution or agreement. What steps are being taken or have been taken? What is the potential for steps to be being taken? And figure out the challenges to taking those steps. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you all 4 of our panelists for helping tee up the issues. I've got a good set of questions to begin the conversation, but I'm eager for more. So for those who are interested, the Q&A function is up and running, and we're pulling down your questions as fast as we can capture them. So let me start with a question. It's actually several people have asked in various ways, focused on the challenge of sustainability broadly, and I open this to any of our panelists, but we have several speakers or several participants who've asked about the pressure of economic growth, what one participant calls the march to development. And the argument is, isn't this the real culprit? Isn't that pressure for economic growth, particularly the way it's being done now, what keeps us from achieving a sustainable future? Or as one of the folks framing these questions said, leaves us in our current dire situation. So among our panelists, would any of you like to pick that up and run with it? Tom Lovejoy.
So I think a lot of the environmental destruction, not just to biodiversity, but the other kinds of problems actually can be traced back to pretty poor economic analyses. I know that, most infrastructure projects like the big highways that run through tropical forests and the rest, nobody ever calculates in advance what it's going to cost to maintain them. So I think the number one fix is to just try and do the standard economics in a better way. But I think there is a really interesting exercise going on at the moment, commissioned by the UK government, the Treasury Department, on the economics of biodiversity. It's led by Professor Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge. If anybody wants to get a midterm peek at it, the London School of Economics did a webinar on it about 2 to 3 weeks ago, which can be seen online. And basically that report is going to make a very strong case for better economic decision-making by including ecosystem services. And ecosystem services will always underestimate the value of whatever bit of nature it is, but to quote Pavan Sukhdev, if you don't put some kind of value on it, decision makers will treat it as zero.
Others of our panelists, Ambassador Suazo, I think I saw you. Please do jump in. Ambassador, you may be muted. I think we still can't hear you, Mr. Ambassador. So there we go. Got it.
Okay.
Go right ahead, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a few elements to the conversation because I like it in the way you frame so many questions in one general topics, and I was listening what Mr. Tom was saying, and I totally agree with him. But you see, we have to take into consideration many different scenarios. And I said that because I have been following discussions in the United Nations General Assembly and specialized committees of the General Assembly related to these particular issues, the big convention, the big treaties, and the understand the climate change, environmental issues. So, and I just always emotionally the country with huge economic and development challenges, inequality, poverty, social exclusion, are one of the biggest challenges in more than 60% of the countries of the world, more than that. So decades ago, I managed to listen an economics and a philosopher, and he drew a line on the planet. So this is the planet today, talking about a couple of decades ago. And if you see on the side of this line, you will see poverty. And on the upper side of this line in the planet, you will see rich countries. So every time that a developing country, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, those for Latin America, but I see Malaysia, Indonesia, and needless to say, all Africa except for the Gulf countries, which are rich in one particular resources, they face this problem of inequality, poverty, social exclusion, and mitigation of environmental problems, climate change. When the Paris Agreement discussion, and it was very, very close not to be agreed on, those countries came with a very, very common sense line who was saying, yes, we share the problem. We have an equal responsibility, but it's also differentiated. They would like to do their quota of participation, but how can you implement such huge political guidelines adopted in the United Nations General Assembly by head of states? Actually, when Sue was saying, when they come back home, they are not have any possibility to deliver because the pressure of these elements on their own indigenous development impede them to do. They have bigger challenge, how to combat poverty, how to feed the people, how to produce energy at the lower cost to make it that more broad spread to the population in order that everyone to benefit. So changing the fossil fuel carbon print, it will be a big challenge. And I always challenge the academic sector to come out with the real tangible solutions that allow these countries to really change these basic policies of economic development in order to really be able to change their mentality, the policymakers' mentality, the politicians' mentality, as well as the educational sectors in those countries to educate better the people and to really offer a better opportunity for the sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goal is a huge, huge agenda. It touches every single aspect of human life. So the United Nations became a huge think tank. And we are trying to measure how to achieve those Sustainable Development Goals. But these differentiations, these tangible problems at the country, national, and regional level, in every country, made very difficult to achieve those. It's just, I wanted to add this to the conversation, and I'm sorry if I extended too much.
No, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You've gotten to the critical challenge here in thinking about how we do achieve a sustainable future, and it is to understand the trade-offs that policymakers face, frankly, and that people face. Mark Ashton, you spent some of your introductory remarks on that very trade-off in the context of forests, and a couple of questions have come in that push you a little further. Specifically, we have one participant who says, how do we get the resources to those in the local communities adjacent to forests to encourage conservation of those forest resources rather than unsustainable forest exploitation? Exactly the same trade-off that Ambassador Suazo has just focused us on. And Mark, while I'm about to hand you the virtual microphone, I'm going to offer a second question that comes your way, which it says, how do we balance the use of wood and the preservation of forests? It seemed like, says this observer, there was a lot of woodwork in the background of Professor Ashton's video. And so it's a personal as well as a more institutional question.
Goodness. Okay. Well, can I, one thing that I'd like to add to Tom and his comments, I think we as a society are very bad at trying to evaluate risk in natural systems and under an economic framework. We do, I think that we're not very good at evaluating risk. And when you look at most forests, native forests, are on marginal lands. And they're on marginal lands because they're unproductive. It's very difficult to sustain agriculture on them. They are inherently, because they're on marginal lands, slow growing. They are inherently, because they're slow growing, the benefits that are provided by that forest cover tend to be diverse, but they're diverse from a biological reason, and they're diverse from a society reason. And we tend to be, when we think about society, we tend to be very focused on one value or another and not good at integrating multiple values from one resource in economics and evaluating risk on top of that. So I just stopped there. Now, what was the first question, Dan?
The second question was really about it's about the balancing of use of wood versus preservation of forests.
Well, I didn't ask the first question either. So, so the second question, why wood? Well, when forests are managed sustainably, they're a very valuable, both service and commodity value, both protecting biodiversity, but it requires sophisticated knowledge, strong land tenure, strong investment for long-term future, all these sorts, all this kind of social and economic framework to manage sustainability is often not there for managing forests, for wood or for any other value. So trying to sustain sustainability in forests is really being risk averse, because most of them are in marginal lands, and accommodating just not wood from your forest, but from a multiple series of values. For example, most wood from native forests, only a small proportion is utilized. And you can't harvest oak trees, okay, which is what you see in the back there, in a plantation. You can't grow oak trees in a plantation. You can't grow mahogany very well in all these long-term woods are very compatible in management regimes where there is secure tenure, in which they are managed with all sorts of other values, in which you essentially account for that value as just a component of the multitude of values, the biodiversity values, the water values, the climate mitigation values that those forests provide.
So Mark, can I push, because there's another question now that relates to this that I want to maybe have you and others react to, and that is, we've got a participant asking, isn't it critical to policy that we actually measure both the impacts of activities, but also the potential value? It also goes to what Ambassador Suazo was saying about the need to recognize that economic opportunities can't be ignored. And so this participant is saying, shouldn't we be doing more in terms of measurement of the environmental, social, and economic issues as part of a policy foundation?
Absolutely. We're very, very bad at monitoring, and we're very, very bad at collecting data for monitoring. And when you're looking at management, it's an adaptive learning process, and that requires data. It requires monitoring data, and it requires learning as one moves. But the technical knowledge of managing forests is there. It's ancient. Swidden agriculture, indigenous peoples have managed forests for thousands of years. We don't actually use that knowledge in our own sort of capitalist system. We could incorporate that knowledge. Why, for example, are we trying to create permanent agricultural systems on marginal land? We should be thinking about successional agroforestry systems, imitating Swidden systems, in other words, compatible on the right sites, integrated within reserves, where you don't manage, where you try and but it requires sophistication. It requires rich knowledge, and again comes back to social stability and the creation of a social framework from which you can do that for the long term. Because you invest now for something, oak, you invest in something for 100 years' time. There are multiple benefits that come with that, and you invest with multiple other species. In a stratified mixed native forest, you never grow oak in a plantation. It's susceptible to insects, disease. It would never be economically viable. And so there's a history of exploitation of these kinds of woods exploited from native forests without long-term security in their reinvestment. And,
So
and
Mark,
that's,
thank you. Thank you for that insight. I can't help but mention with regard to measurement that a team at Yale, along with colleagues at Columbia yesterday, released a biennial environmental performance index that scores countries across the world on 32 different indicators of their success in addressing the full scope of sustainability issues, including environmental public health and ecosystem vitality across 11 major policy categories. So for those who are interested, that index is now available online at epi.yale.edu. And of perhaps note to some, the number one scoring country in this iteration, every 2 years this scoring is done, this iteration puts Denmark in the number one slot, largely as a function of the significant policy advances that they've undertaken on climate change. So again, for those who are interested, one of the themes coming through here is that policy matters. Getting policies right is not easy, but good policy is absolutely critical to the sustainability challenge broadly and to climate change in particular. In that regard, I do want to now dig in on some of the aspects that have come to the fore through our and several people have written to talk about what needs to be done on climate change. One participant writes that it seems like renewable energy is the essential pathway to a successful response to climate change, and goes on to say, is it possible to imagine a complete overhaul of our energy sector and a transition to 100% renewable energy? And a second participant in parallel writes, would it ever be possible to get the oil and gas industry, and presumably fossil fuels more broadly, to be part of that transition? And if so, how? So thoughts or comments on the possibility of this transition to a clean energy and sustainable future? Marion.
Yes, thanks. I think renewable energy has made a lot of progress in the last 15 to 20 years. We have seen this progress everywhere, especially in the United States, where we've increased our renewable energy share a great deal. But I don't think we can pilot our system only on renewable energy from what we know today. I took a deep dive into autonomous vehicles to see how they were doing, and I can probably say that in my lifetime, which has maybe 25 more years or so, we won't be seeing the magic of cars driving themselves and going into parking lots and doing all the right things. It's just not there. There's so many reasons why, including safety and cost and so forth. And so we know that we can use renewable fuels to create gasoline for cars, to create the fuel for cars. But the challenge is so great. We're only at 7% now for renewables, and you can't really make steel very easily or convert very easily. I'm talking about heavy industries that are still important around the world. So I think that we can keep going, but I'm very concerned about that, just the answer being the whole big number, that we really have to set goals that we can reach, and innovation will catch up, and maybe we'll get there someday.
Marion, thank you. Several of our participants are pushing on this question of what it would take to move to a clean energy future with a couple of items I want to put in front of our panel. Several people have said that the Paris Agreement, as Subiniaz has pointed out, provides a good starting point, but it's going to need reinforcement. And one of the things that is being highlighted by several of our questions coming in is the possibility of carbon charges or carbon taxes in some form or another. So I'm interested in what people think that is an important part of the incentive structure. And second, with a specific request that this go to Subiniaz, to help ensure that a carbon tax system would not burden those who are taking the issue seriously and imposing charges on their industry. Would it make sense for the WTO to provide a system of border tax adjustment that would allow countries that are running out in front on this issue and putting in place serious carbon chargers not to be competitively disadvantaged in global marketplace. So anyone first on the general issue of carbon charges, and then we'll let Sue talk about the more specific question of protecting those who put carbon charges in place.
Yeah, well, I can say a little bit about that. I mean, I guess you can think about carbon charges in two different ways: at the national level, maybe even at the subnational level, if you think about California. But certainly at the national level, like no country is prohibited under the Paris Agreement from designing whatever kind of nationally determined contribution it wants to, and that could take the form of a tax, it could take the form of cap and trade or whatever else. There really are no kind of limitations. Separate question is whether countries or a subset of the world's countries should get together and do some kind of collaborative carbon charge, tax, cap and trade, something like that. And how would that interface with the WTO? I think, you know, Tim might want to put on into the chat room a link to the online book that I mentioned before, because it has several relevant chapters in it. A couple chapters on sort of so-called carbon clubs and another one on border carbon adjustments, which are obviously very related. Well, I think it all depends how you design that kind of grouping. I mean, the argument for it is that while Paris is the right, I guess I would argue, the right design for the entire, to bring in the entire world, you might want to go beyond it with a subgroup of countries. And, but then you have to think about, so what is the thing you're all agreeing to? Which countries are in a position to actually go beyond what they agreed to in the Paris Agreement? Was there something in the Paris Agreement that, did they want to go beyond it and they didn't go beyond it for some reason? I would argue that a lot of the countries didn't go beyond it because they didn't want to go beyond it. And so I'm not sure who exactly out there, which countries are in a position to take on more robust commitments. But assuming for the sake of argument, there are such countries, you'd have to figure out what exactly is the standard they're agreeing to and what action are they taking for sort of competitiveness reasons against countries that are not part of that club. Some argue that there should be a limitation on the ability to trade emissions allowances, and that would be the subject of what the club would be about. Others have taken more dramatic positions and said that, you know, those outside the club, high tariffs should be imposed on every one of their exports. I think that's the Bill Nordhaus Carbon Club vision. So it kind of depends, the relationship to the WTO depends very much on what it is that what kind of action you're taking vis-a-vis countries outside your club. I think one of the reasons I was arguing for some kind of team to investigate what needs to be done is precisely because there isn't much, or there isn't, let's say, the necessary amount of clarity coming from the WTO on what the rules are for border carbon adjustments. So there's a lot written about it. When countries are thinking about imposing border carbon adjustments, they're obviously getting advice from people who are steeped in WTO law, but nobody's actually sure how these things would play out in the WTO, which could have kind of a chilling effect on the ability of either individual countries to impose them or groups of countries to impose them. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. I'm actually seeing now a couple of questions about how we take this agenda of moving to a sustainable future to the corporate world. So let me start with one, Marion, aimed at you, building on your industrial ecology experience. And it says, this is from David O'Connor, that industrial ecology has long been discussed, but not widely practiced in the actual corporate world. And why is that? Is it a function of cost, or is it some kind of a flaw in the model of industrial ecology?
Thank you for that question. That's a great. I think that industrial ecology, and let me say that I'm the director of the Yale Center for Industrial Ecology, and I'm the past president of the International Society for Industrial Ecology. and what that's all about. And I've seen there have been many inquiries about a circular economy. And industrial ecology is foundationally about two things. One is loop closing. And so it's very much aligned with the circular economy. We work very hard on circular economy legislation because we know the science behind it. And we've been practicing that science for 25 years now. And that's been a great contribution. And it's wonderful that the world is starting to want to be circular. Another important tenet of industrial ecology is looking at whole life cycles. And the very tool, the software for life cycle assessment has broken out everywhere because companies realize that they can save money and make the environment cleaner in so many ways. You know, I'll give you a gross example. Air conditioners, I would contend, save lives because we're seeing such high temperature raises in South Asia and other parts of the world that air conditioning becomes almost necessity. Now, I know there are other practices on smaller scales, but imagine if you're the company that could make the air conditioner that really was the most sustainable and would be a 10 or 20 or 30% improvement on what we're doing now. That's why that would be my response also to the question about economic growth. It's how you do economic growth, not economic growth per se, but using the tools and the innovation and the technology transfer that Sue mentioned. All those things could help us go even faster in a direction that's much more towards sustainability.
So let's push the question to a broader scope with several other participants coming in with questions around what should be done to get the corporate world to pursue sustainability. A related separate question, can corporate sustainability only be done by regulation, by policy, or could consumers be part of this, driving change by asking for more sustainable products? And I might add, or could investors by insisting on greater access to the environmental, social, and governance performance metrics related to the companies they're putting money into, help change the trajectory of business practice? Do any of you want to jump in on those issues?
Well, I want to say maybe a teeny bit about the role of business and other non-state actors. And Dan, this is an issue near and dear to your heart, but I would just say I think the Paris Agreement is pretty unusual and broke new ground. It didn't break as much ground as Dan would have liked, because he would have liked for non-state actors to be able to literally join the Paris Agreement, but it came as close as it could have come at the time, and kind of forged a whole new way of looking at international agreements, which could be a model for other kinds of international agreements. So in other words, at the time that the Paris Agreement was adopted, the regime sort of developed all kinds of ways for non-state actors to engage with the process, including by taking on commitments, which includes commitments from the corporate sector. And it's really just exploded in the last couple of years in terms of the involvement of companies, whether they're taking on short-term commitments or whether they're committing to net zero emissions by 2050. And it's been really quite inspiring. And then I would say, just in terms of the US in particular, the President Trump's announcement 3 years ago, almost exactly, that the United States was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement triggered also a kind of domestic explosion in commitments from all kinds of actors, not just states and cities, but the corporate sector, in terms of what their contribution would be to the Paris Agreement and the US target in particular. And that has just not abated at all. It's gotten stronger and stronger. And I think it's probably here with us to stay, even if we end up rejoining the agreement.
Thank you, Sue. We're down to our last 2 minutes. So I'm going to ask a final question, give each of you as well as a chance to answer in 10 seconds or less. It could be, in fact, yes or no answer, but a yes or no answer in 1 sentence of explanation. It comes on the heels of what several of you have said about the pending challenge in front of us. So the question is this: are we approaching a climate change doomsday? Tom Lovejoy.
Not if we do the right things.
Ashton.
I think in general, yes.
Ambassador Suazo.
I am very optimistic that we can change behavior and that we can prevail.
I fear it will be unequal, and some parts of the world will be okay, and some will be under tremendous stress.
Biennial, after a lifetime of trying to avoid the climate change doomsday, have succeeded or not?
I'm become convincingly or progressively convinced that it's going to take more than mitigation and adaptation, and we're going to need to do research on solar radiation management.
That is a wonderful way to close out a very rich dialogue across many topics that are critical for our sustainable future, critical issues that we might celebrate the very conversation around today on World Environment Day. So let me offer a virtual round of applause to all of our panelists, and thank you all who've signed in to be part of this conversation. A special thanks to the UNITAR team. Ambassador Suazo, thank you for your personal participation, and all those who work with you for helping us get this conversation launched today. My apologies to those in our question and answer queue whose questions are not going to be able to be offered up for discussion, but I thank all of you who did put your ideas into this discussion today. And again, as I opened by saying, from all of us at Yale, you have our promise to keep this dialogue going. There's lots more to discuss, many more issues. Had we had time, there were important questions about oceans, about policy tools, about a range of other sustainability elements. So there is much more to discuss on another day. But let me close where we again began by wishing everyone a very happy and perhaps reflective World Environment Day. And thank you for being part of our webinar. We look forward to the conversation continuing in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you very much, Dan. We are proud and happy to be in this format, and we will ready to continue our collaboration. Thanks to our panelists, amazing. I always learn, and it was a very productive day for me personally. Thank you very much to all of you.
And with that, we sign off from our virtual locations across the United States and around the world. Thanks again to everyone who's signed in. Really been a pleasure.